Yogananda, my life with Kriyananda, I wanted to share also several lessons that I learned from Swamiji about his life even before he met Yogananda. And this lesson is one for all of us, and that is to introspect, that if we have a spiritual perspective towards life, to look back on our own lives and perhaps our childhood and our formative years, and just sort of see what were the deepest lessons that we learned in those experiences. And one of the greatest ones for us could be acceptance, simple acceptance of the way things are. And Swamiji talks about this in Affirmations for Self-Healing, when he says, one of the most difficult lessons in life is to learn to accept things as they are. How much energy we waste in trying to wish away the inevitable. If only this hadn't happened. If only we had reached there in time. The if-onlys and the might-have-beens in life keep us from dealing realistically with what is. And thinking on this a little bit, I think that perhaps all of us have those what-ifs and if-onlys, things that we wished had been different. And it's wonderful to look at how grateful we are, how fortunate we are that they didn't turn out differently. When we're in the moment, it's very easy to think that I wish this wasn't happening. But when we look back over the distance of years, of decades, especially from a spiritual perspective, the more that we live with spiritual attitudes, the more we realize how many lessons there are for us just in day-to-day life, if we choose to learn those lessons. And inevitably, thinking back, we know that there were people who hurt us, and we hurt people. And now we can let it go. It has no meaning whatsoever. And one of the most powerful things we can do is to forgive those people who hurt us, whether you'll ever meet them again. Forgive them in your heart. Ask God to forgive them. And to forgive yourself, knowing that in the long run, we are all children of the same God. And Yogananda said once, let me see if I can find that quote, because it's a wonderful one. Swamiji writes in The New Path, God is our only reality. Ineluctably, we are led, quickly or slowly, by one path or another, toward this divine understanding that God is our only reality. In this thought, I'm reminded of a brother disciple who once asked our guru, "Will I ever leave the spiritual path?" The master answered, "How could you? Everyone in the world is on the spiritual path. Everyone in the world is on the spiritual path. Some people are consciously aware of it, and some people are completely ignorant of that fact. But if we start to see the world more and more in this way, that we're all brothers and sisters on the spiritual path, and then there comes a desire to help others, to help strangers along on the spiritual path. At the same time, we don't feel a sense of being a missionary or pushing people in any way, because everyone comes through their own paths in their own time. And giving them positive encouragement is certainly a great blessing and a great help for them. At the same time, they need to come to it in their own time and in their own way. And so an encouraging word, a smile, an act of friendship can be very powerful. But don't be attached. Don't give them the autobiography of a yogi and say, "Oh, you must read this," if you're not sure that they must read that. Rather, be a divine friend and be sensitive to what they are ready to hear, what they want to hear, what will encourage them in their growth. And it's so interesting the different ways, as Master was saying, everyone comes in their different path and the different ways that realizations come to individuals. And Swamiji is talking here also about his own childhood, and his parents were American, but they lived most of their lives in Europe. And they were pioneers in their time of international living, international cooperation, and being citizens of the world. And Swamiji was born in Romania, where his father was stationed. His father was a scientist. He became the head oil geologist for the Standard Oil Esso company in Europe. And Swamiji grew up with a very international background. And he would speak, as a young boy, he would speak English to his parents and German to his nanny and Romanian to most of the people around him. And he said about his father and his mother, he said about his father, "I earnestly tried to share his interests, but where my father was attracted to the how of things, I was attracted to the why. He was a scientist, and I, instinctively, a mystic and philosopher." And so in this way, though his father was very loving, they were never on the same wavelength in terms of communicating with each other. Mother, on the other hand, and I understood one another intuitively. Ours was a communication of souls, less so one of speech. Though she never spoke of praying for us children, I know that her prayers and love for me were my greatest blessing during the formative years of my life. Now, the interesting thing for Swamiji during those formative years is, even though he had loving parents, he grew up feeling very distant from the world in general. And when he was just 9 years old, he became very ill, and the doctor suggested a healthier climate in Switzerland. And so he was sent off to a boarding school in Switzerland. It was a French-speaking boarding school, and was there for a year and a half, unhappily, very homesick, being such a young child away from his family for the first time. And he said also about that period when he finally came back home, he said, "My absence from home had had its effect on me. Whether I liked it or not, I now was a little less dependent on the home for which I had so recently been pining. God was weaning me from dependence on earthly security. My illness, my consequent absence, in that condition in a distant land, my growing sense of aloneness, these were, I think, meant only to help me realize that my true home is not here on earth, but in God." And that realization comes to each of us in different ways. And for Swamiji, continually, through one experience after another, in his childhood and youth, these lessons seem to come back to him. And very often, if we reflect on our own growing up, these lessons are painful at the time. And yet, looking back, we can see more clearly if we introspect and see these experiences from a divine perspective. We see more of the purpose. And Swamiji, after being in Switzerland, soon after went to boarding school in England for 2 years, since he couldn't get that education in Romania. And finally, he had never lived in America all of these years, but finally, when he was high school age, the Second World War broke out, and his parents had to return to America. And he continued his education and his difficult lessons in America. And I too, growing up, felt very much separate from the world, rather an observer. And some of us have felt this in our lives, just sort of not quite fitting in with most other people and their values, not quite belonging. And I had always felt this growing up, and yet I see that now too as a great blessing. When I was 7 years old, I lost my father, and our home life completely changed. My mother, who had never worked before, had to go out to work with no particular skills and learned how to be a waitress, and then she became a grocery clerk and just stayed in that same job for the rest of her life. And I too, it's rather like that was sort of the end of my childhood in a sense, because I was my mother had 4 children to raise, and I needed to do my part, so to speak, do whatever household chores that were mine to do, and as soon as I could, start to earn a little money on my own. And so that sense of duty became very strong. At the same time, part of the blessing was I realized that I could be responsible. I could take care of myself, and that my needs were very few. And I didn't have a desire for luxury. I didn't have a desire, a drive to work very hard to earn money, because those luxuries and a comfortable way of life really were not that important for me from the beginning. And Swamiji said about, he was talking about as a teenager, this time in America, and he said, most of the young people I met during my adolescence seemed secure in their values. The 1940s were not like today, when it is common for young people to question society's values, to seek meaning, to ponder its and their relationship to the universe and to God. When I was in high school, as nearly as I could tell, I walked alone in such questing. All I knew definitely was that I wanted something, and that something didn't seem to be what anyone else wanted. Well, I was a little different growing up in the sense that by the time I was a teenager, many young people were questioning society's values and looking for meaning, for meaningful alternatives. And so I didn't feel completely alone, though each of us was seeking in different ways. And Swamiji was far ahead of me in many ways, having an international upbringing, meeting and being with many different kinds of people from different nationalities. He could see where their lives had been, where they were going, and he could choose, is that a possible direction for me? And I, on the other hand, growing up, I was very isolated. We grew up in a small town, far away from any other town. And my childhood was spent a little bit in a fantasy world, sort of waiting until I could leave that place to explore the greater world. And my favorite subjects were things like English literature and history and geography that taught me about a larger world, with the hope that maybe there I would fit in and that I would find a place for myself. And it didn't take me long after I did leave that town and went to a larger city to realize that the larger world really didn't hold that much that appealed to me either. And I started to look within for those answers. Now, this was the path that the growing up lessons that came to Swamiji and the ones that came to me. Other people, it's very different. Maybe they have success. Maybe they realize their dreams, and that might be a successful career, it might be a successful family and home life. And then little by little, They realize that these things in themselves are not a source of happiness, of lasting happiness. And so too, each one of us seeks on a deeper level. And as Swamiji was saying, each one in their own way and at their own pace. And one lesson for us today is to look back at our own lives with gratitude for all of the experiences that have come to us, all of the lessons that we've learned or that we can learn from those experiences if we just go within a little more. And also to look back, as I said, with gratitude and acceptance, knowing that everything has come to us in the way that it has meant to come to us, and that it is up to us to accept, appreciate, and learn from the lessons that have come. Thank you so much for sharing with me this evening.